So let's start with the Bahaya Sutta. Bahaya was not a bhikkhu. He was, in fact, what you would call a rishi or a wanderer in the time of the Buddha. That, in fact, it's fairly well known that in the time of the Buddha, there was a big, big increase in the number of people who were, let us say, seeking the holy life as best way they could. Now, this was not just in India, but it was also the time of uh, Socrates, Herodotus, Lao Tzu, Mahavira. It was kind of a worldwide, uh, maybe you could even say a worldwide recognition that society was not working. So here we have this Bahaya, and that he was dressed in what is called um, bark cloth. Now, bark cloth is made from the bark of only a few trees. That, in fact, one of the ways of doing it is by using the bark of a bamboo tree. Or in the West, we have birch. So a birch bark. And what they do is they make very thin strips and then weave that. So it's actually a kind of a cloth as opposed to just taking the bark off a tree and plastering it to the body as a breastplate or something. And that was common in the time of the Buddha. Bark cloth was uh, probably one of the easiest ways of making cloth. And so he was sitting, uh, almost enlightened, figuring out that he was the best dude in town. In fact, you could say that Bahia was kind of the original fake arahat. We've got a lot of them nowadays. And that the fake arahat then uh, heard, in fact, he probably got the idea from himself by thinking about it, that maybe I ought to go check out the Buddha to see what's really going on. And so he found the Buddha while the Buddha was actually on Bendabat, and the kind of question that he was asking, as well as the way he presented himself, and also possibly because the Buddha already knew him, he wanted him to go and stay with the bhikkhus. That he didn't want to answer the question right then, as well as that was not the appropriate time for the monks to stop and give a Dhamma talk. But Bahia pestered him. He kept pestering him, and so the Buddha finally gave him the following advice: the scene is just the scene. The herd is just the herd. The felt is just the felt. In other words, just the five senses without the perception or all the understanding, but just basically to come into the fourth jhana. Now, this is an example then of someone who could be in that state and still out walking around. But it's, as you could see from the end of the sutta, that it became quite dangerous for him because he was out walking that same afternoon, and in the process, he ran across a cow with a young calf, and instead of giving the cow her way, getting out of the way, basically on fear that if you run across a cow who has a calf and she lets you know you better not mess with her or the calf, and you don't pay any attention to that, then, like Baha'i, you probably will get killed. And so you could say that he was practicing what the Buddha taught, but not at the right place, not at the right time. And the Buddha knew that, but he gave the advice anyway because of the insistence of uh, the rishi. So, what does this actually mean? This can be considered dispassion, but that actually takes much of the power out of this state of being. That what we're actually talking about is that you cognize or you see or you feel or you're in the five senses, but you're only in the five senses. You're not making up any stories about it. And because there's no stories about it, in other words, we are beyond perception. And if we are beyond perception, that means that we're also beyond feelings. That in fact, this is possibly the only place in the suttas where someone can be in that state and still out walking around. That mostly one needs to be quiet, in seclusion, and not out rambling around. So I would I would highly recommend not driving a car when you're in such a state. Yeah, you can see the cars coming, but you're not going to react to it because the seeing is not enough. You have to actually see it, perceive it as a car, perceive it as heading direct for you, and then perceive that it's dangerous, and then you're going to do something about it. So this state is a state where we are just in sensory input. This would be, in fact, as I said, a kind of a fourth jhana state, and that it is actually possible for each one of you to experience this. It's not a great big deal unless you're out walking, and it can be very dangerous. But if you are alone, quiet, secluded, and not in danger, then you can come into a state of just listening, just paying attention, and then in fact possibly the easiest way to do it is with the lights off, just paying attention to the sensations of the body. Just being here is that state. And that if you already are familiar with Paticca Samuppada, we know that this is kind of like the third um, item on the list of just being conscious, not actually making anything out of it. So, uh, this state actually is it's quite delightful to be just in the here now, completely in the here now, without telling ourselves any stories or anything about what's going on, but just being. Now, in this state, you could call it, in fact, without perception, there is no feeling. But on the way to there, in the fourth jhana, we would have what is referred to as boundless consciousness, which means there's only consciousness. It's not bounded by or attached to perception. And then you can have a state that's called neither perception nor non-perception. And in the state of neither perception nor non-perception, that's the analogy, by the way, in the Visuddhimagga is having a clay bowl that had oil in it, but the oil has been removed. And there's nothing in that bowl, but if you wipe your finger or a cloth around the bowl, you will find just a little bit of oil left because it's in the clay. And so this state of neither perception or non-perception means that you can at least tell yourself that you're in a state of that just consciousness. And then there's a state that's called the nothingness, and this is fairly close to the state of nothingness. And in the body, there's also the state that's called the body without boundaries. Now, I know that some, let us say, non-mathematicians who have done translations will mistakenly use the word infinite, like infinite boundaries or infinite consciousness, but that's completely, let us call it, misuse of the word. A better word would be boundless, that we don't see. In other words, when we're in the body in that state, the only thing that we are actually experiencing the body, but it is boundless. That's all there is. It doesn't go into infinity, because if you chase it into infinity, that's going to have to be done with perception or telling yourself a story. So this is the state of abhaya, and that we can call it dispassion, but basically what we're really talking about is that when we have non-perception, when perception is closed down, and we're not telling ourselves any stories about anything, we're just experiencing it, then because we're not telling ourselves any stories, we're not contacting, and because we're not contacting, there's no feeling. And so this is actually the sequence of events that you would find in Paticca Samuppada. Step 3, 4, 5, and 6 would be that we're just seeing, and then we start telling ourselves stories about it. We make up a story, and then that contacts us, and that gives feelings. So if we have no feelings, that means that we're not telling ourselves any stories, which means we're not making up any stories, which means that we're just in sensory awareness. So, do we have any questions about that? Shall we go on with this topic, or shall we move on to the 5 lower fetters? Anybody? How about you, Nick?
No questions. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me re-emphasize that you too can go into that state, that it's not a magical state. It's not a big deal. That in fact, possibly in your childhood or maybe as a teenager, you've already experienced this state. You didn't know that you were experiencing it, it didn't have a label to it, but that it's not a magical place. You'll see some of the monks who um, want to put superlatives on it. No, it's magical, and oh, it's this, that, and the other thing. They even will use the word deep, deep into meditation.
There's
And
still
there's
an
not a,
awareness. There
sorry, go
is
ahead.
there's still an awareness of the senses in those states, correct? I mean, it's just they're
That's
not.
all there is. In fact, that's it. But that's
Yeah.
all there is just those senses. That's
Well,
all there is to it, is just in sensory awareness without making up any stories or any thoughts or playing any music in your head or anything like that. It's just full on the experience of this present moment. If you have your eyes open, then the eyes would be what we would call in gazing as opposed to looking, that we have the ability to pinpoint and to look. Let me give you an example of that. The farmer is out in the farm, and that he looks up, and in his distance, there is a forest. And if he starts looking at a particular tree, if he's looking for something, he hears a noise and he's looking, he probably is not going to see the fact that the opposing army is completely infiltrated the woods. But if you have a gaze, if you're just gazing, then any movement that's shown in that forest will immediately become available to you. And so this is the difference then between looking or pinpointing or spotting or looking at something. Rather, we're just looking out or gazing. So the same thing then would be true about the body, that we're kind of gazing the body without looking at any particular part of the body. So, Santiago, do you have any questions about this? All right. How about you, Michael Swift?
No questions.
No questions. Okay. How many of you think that you can actually do this, or in fact have done it by mistake or accident? Yeah, everybody's done this. Everybody's been able to do this before. This is not a magical state. But you also recognize how dangerous it is to be out driving or walking around cattle with um infant cows, that you don't want to get into that state when you're out and wandering around. But in fact, this is partially related to that story about that if one becomes an arahat, that means that he's possibly going to be spending a lot of time in this state. And for that reason, he needs to be ordained, he needs to be in a wat, he needs to be protected through seclusion or protected by the other monks. Because if that arahat walks out of the temple, he could get run over because he's not really paying attention to the road. He's too busy paying attention to what's going on within himself. So let us move on to another topic, which would be the three lower fetters. Now, the three lower fetters actually are mostly one place in particular they're discussed is in the Sabha Asava Sutta, which is Sutta number 2 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And by the way, the Baya Sutta, I think, is in the Udana. And that means then that it's probably a very, very old sutta. It was possibly done in the early life of the Buddha's teaching. So, in the Sabha Asava Sutta, the first 11 verses, according to the translation that Nanamali had done and published by Bhikkhu Bodhi, the first part of the sutta is talking about knowledge. In other words, deliverance by knowledge. And that part of it has to do with this is where it's actually specified of the question of who am I? You've seen many different, especially Hindu systems, with that as a meditation object of who am I? And that the Buddha in this sutta recommends what was I in the past? Who am I now? What will I be in the future? How do I get from the present into the future? And all of those kind of questions winds up being a thicket of views. It has no answer to it. That there's also an old Brahmanistic set of questions is that is the soul and the body the same? Is the soul and the body different? And all of those kind of questions are all just a ticket of views. They are not worthy of our attention. And then it specifies what is worthy of attention versus what is not worthy of attention is that those things that are not worthy of attention are, in fact, things that do not increase our let us say, spiritual journey, that they hold us back, asking questions about who am I and what about this and that, is just a thicket of views. But if we pay attention to the right things, then that will increase our spiritual awakening. And what is it that's worthy of paying attention? Anybody know the answer to that? Santiago, pop quiz. What is actually worthy of paying attention?
What's in between your 2 ears?
You're going in the right direction, yes, but that's not exactly the answer that's in the sutta. Does anybody know? How about you, Ivan? Do you know what's in that sutta?
No.
How about hey, Scott? Good to see you, friend. Do you know what's in that sutta?
It's like such as perception, such as its origin, such as its passing away, like such as feeling, right? And are you talking about the thicket of views sutta?
Yes, in fact, it is a personalized, immediate version of the Four Noble Truths. This is suffering.
Oh
This
yeah,
is
yeah.
the cause of suffering. This is the end of suffering, and this is the method to end that suffering. Okay, this is in fact a very immediate way of looking at the Four Noble Truths. Instead of saying this, there is dukkha, a more immediate way of looking at it is this is dukkha. When you see it right there in the mind, you can say, this is it, this is that crap. And then we can reflect upon, oh, the reason that that's there is because I'm being pretty stupid right now. And but I don't have to be stupid. I can drop that. And then, in fact, by the dropping of it completely, you're going to then go right into that state that we were talking about of dispassion with the Abhaya Sutta. So this is actually the whole practice. Now, the Buddha talks about it here is that if you are paying attention to the Four Noble Truths, then that then leads to the destruction of the three lower fetters. The destruction of the three lower fetters comes about by paying attention in this moment to the Four Noble Truths. Most specifically, in this regard, would be the method of removing of these things, which would be, in fact, the built-in point would be to remember. To remember to look at the Four Noble Truths would be the same thing as to remember to see this is dukkha. And then we make the change from that first noble truth to the third noble truth immediately, right here, right now. And that is to come out of that dukkha, to come out of dissatisfaction. Now, one of the other mistranslations of the sutras would be the definition of dukkha would be called suffering. When we're sitting in meditation and sitting quietly and everything is all right, and then some thought of some girl or some thought of some car or some music comes up, that's not suffering, but it does hinder us from being in the state that we want to be in. And so, in that regard, it's unwholesome. It's, in fact, unsatisfying. So we have to make sure that we understand that dukkha actually translates into the word of it's not good enough. I'm dissatisfied with it. So if we can practice the Four Noble Truths according to this method, according to adding, in fact, Sutta number 117 into this, you can see that those suttas are companions with each other. That if you see the thought is unwholesome, you see your attitude is unwholesome, then you can change it right then and there to a wholesome attitude, or change it to a wholesome thought right then and there. And by able to do that, that means then that we have now eliminated 3 lower fetters. Now, the 3 lower fetters are all in a row. The first one, it would be, this is who I am, or this is my thought, or I feel bad, or I feel this or that. That's the personality view of self. But if we are in fact not having those kind of thoughts, but saying instead something like, this is nice, or wow, what a relief it is, then we're taking the I out of it. This is in fact the first fetter is referred to as personality view. Now we can go into great detail about what is personality view, but in the time of the Buddha, possibly the most important quality of it was that it was considered permanent. Now, in Western language and English, we have a whole lot of words that were used in that regard. One of them would be the leopard can't change his spots. The fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. Boys will be boys. In other words, that's that quality of no change. The quality of boys will be boys means that the boys are going to stay boys. Even when they're 40 years old, they're going to get drunk, they're going to fight, they're going to race their cars. They're not ever going to grow up. And so we can see that, in fact, that's not always true. That, in fact, by the time they're 80, they probably are not in fights and probably not out racing their cars, except still in their mind. But that whole quality of permanency, this is in fact going back to the word anatta, because that's actually another bad translation. The word atta does not translate to the word self correctly. It translates instead to the word soul. Now, the idea of a soul is that the soul is permanent. It's who you are at your deepest level. And that the Buddha used the word anatta in the sense of there is no permanent self. There's no permanent soul. There's nothing, in fact, strong enough to survive death. And so this is one of the biggest mistakes that is made by Western Buddhism and others that are using English translations of the suttas, is to miss this point. And so, personality view, then, the number one aspect of it is that you are not permanent, that you can, in fact, change. Does anybody have any question about that point? Personality view, you can change. Your personality is not stuck. You can change, and you can change right now. How about you, Santiago? You got a question about that? Oh, I can't change. Oh, I'm stuck. By the way, on Cathel's Discord group, Happy Gamer, I see people coming on a regular basis. Oh, I can't do it. Oh, I can't change. How many of you have seen that kind of language? Yeah, we see it on a regular basis. They say, oh, I can't change. Oh, it's too hard. That's because they have a personality view. They think that they can't change. But in fact, it's quite easy to change. An example would be you're standing and you're holding your car keys in your hand and you drop them on the floor. Are you going to just stand there? Or are you going to bend down and pick them up? Isn't that a change? Holy moly, it's easy to change. You're changing all the time. In fact, sometimes when we're fidgeting, it's hard to stop changing. It's actually easy. And in fact, if you think that bending over and picking up the keys is easy to do, you can do that with your mind. You don't even have to move the body. You can just immediately change your mind from this is me into this is not mine. That's the easiest thing we can do. That's why it's the very first fetter. It's so easy to change our idea of this is me, this is mine. this is my feeling, into it's just a feeling. And we can change that feeling. So, personality view. Now let's move on. Has anybody got any questions about personality view? Everybody changed their mind already, huh? Personality view, the second of the three lower fetters, in Pali is referred to as Silabasa Paramasa. What this means is, I'll give it to you in this regard, that Eric Berne changed what Freud said. Freud says that there's three ego states, the ego, the superego, and the id. That in fact, modern language has actually changed that. We talk about egotistical and ego. Actually, what we're referring to is the id, the basic part of us. And Eric Berne changed that into parent, adult, and child. So the child is the one who feels, and the parent is the one who issues orders. It's actually the verbal part of the mind. And this Silabata Paramasa actually means that we are attached to the way things should be. We tell ourselves stories about this is what it should be. This is the oughts. It ought to be that way. It's the rules. It's the procedures. It's the way things are done. And this is what we would refer to as the parent ego state. Because we got this from our parents. They told us how things are, and we learned how things are, and we repeat how things are. The reality is that things are not like that at all. That's how they should be. So you can see, in fact, that there's a major interaction between this parent and the personality, which would then be the child. And that what our personality winds up being like on the outside is how we tell ourselves what to do and how to be, and then our internal reaction to those things. Who we are and how it's supposed to be are the personality view, how this is who I am, and I respond or react to what things are supposed to be. And then the third ego state that the Eric Berne mentions is called the the adult ego state, which would be the adult in the room, the one that can see reality. Now, normally there is a dialogue between the child and the parent. The parent in your mind will say, go do this, go do that. And then the child will respond to that, yes, sir, I'll do it right away. Or, no way in hell am I going to do that. And we're always in this dialogue or this conflict. This is actually what causes the duality that is often referred to in Hinduism. The duality between the way that we want it versus the way that it ought to be, instead of living in reality, which is this is the way that it is. This would also be something that we could refer to in the sense of we've talked about unwholesome states and wholesome states, and many people that I've seen recently on Discord will change that from negative to positive. And what I will say is both negative and positive are unwholesome states. Wanting to be different than the way that it is, being positive, is actually not being real. So an optimist and a pessimist are just two opposites of the path, and the middle path. Then the middle place would be, this is it. This is the reality. This is how things really are. And so if we could come out of the parent, stop telling ourselves how it's supposed to be, come out of our feelings of liking and not liking, and just see reality as it is, then this is the correct path. And so if we can do that, if we can come out of personality and come out of Sila Bhatta Paramasa, out of the way things should be, now we can see reality as it is. If we do this over and over and over and over again, we begin to gain some skill at it, and that will then lead to the understanding of this is the path. This is the Eightfold Noble Path. This is the teaching of the Buddha. This is the Four Noble Truths. And when we come out of that doubt about what is the path and what is not the path, this is the third fetter: knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path. This is the right way to live. This is it. Being real. Stop being selfish and stop trying to order the world around to do the way that your mommy told you that it was supposed to be, and just live in reality as it is. So, Joshua, do you have any questions about this?
Yes. I was wondering on the past mention of the translation of no self being a bad translation of anatta. That is the chitta included in that definition of anatta, or is it beyond it in some way?
I missed a word or two in there. Can you repeat what you're saying?
Right. I was wondering if the chitta is included in what's not the self, is included in what's not personality.
Okay, so you're using the word chitta or sita. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. In the Pali, there is another word that I'll introduce to you that's not used very much, but it is used, and that is manu. Now, manu would be, in fact, what we refer to as the adult in the room, or the frontal cortex. That, in fact, in neuroscience, we could refer to these three ego states as the reptilian brain, which is associated with our feelings, and that would be the child ego state. And then we would have the mammalian brain, or the temporal lobe, or this part of the mind, then would be the parent. That's where we have language stored and all of that kind of stuff. And then we would have the frontal cortex, that which makes us human, that part of the brain that dogs and monkeys don't have. And even though many of the humans that I have seen, it looks like they've got a frontal cortex, they don't know what to do with it. They don't ever use it. You could say about 90% of the people rarely use that frontal cortex. For instance, you can learn mathematics just by memorizing the multiplication tables and things like that. That a lot of mathematics is memorization as opposed to actual thinking things through, or being able to see things clearly. So the word sita then would be referred to more as either the combination of the parent and the child, or most specifically the child. That, in fact, when we talk about it as the four foundations of mindfulness, the body would be Kaya Nupassana, the feelings would be Vedana Nupassana, and then we would have for the mind Chitta Nupassana. Remember that this is the part that needs to be fixed. And then we would have the Dhamma Nupassana, which would be the moment by moment things that are arising and passing away, including our own thoughts. But in the Chitta Nupassana, we can also think of that as our basic attitude, our attitude about the world. In other words, mostly people have the attitude of being a victim. We're victims of the world. We're a victim to the government. We're victims to the cops. We're victims to the teachers. We're victims to the principals. We're victims to God. We're victims to all kinds of things. so long as we practice that duality in place. And the first thing that we do is we reverse that and say, wait a minute, I'm the king here. I'm the boss. I can manage my feelings. I can do the way that I want to do. And then the next thing would be is to combine those two so that there's no up or down. There's just friendship. There's just noble friendship. So your question about the chitta would be the lower quality of mind, especially the feelings that are associated primarily with fear. And look at all the words that we have in English for the various emotions, all of them based in fear. How about anger, frustration, sense of loss, grief, um, despair? All of those have a basic quality of fear. And that the whole point about being in charge of your life, to come out of that victimhood into uh, being the winner, changing our attitude, would be coming out of our fear. Not to the point of becoming fearless, but rather into the point of feeling safe. That in fact, we almost always use the word fearless or fearlessness in the sense of bravery, that somebody knows their danger and they go into it anyway. To where Abaya, he wasn't afraid of that cow. He had no fear at all. That's why the cow killed him, is because he did that ignorantly, in a sense that he wasn't really paying attention to the outside world at all. Okay, so here what we're practicing now is that sense of safety and security, which is exactly the opposite of fear, as opposed to adding bravery on top of the fear, covering it up. So we're going to feel safe, feel secure, feel confident. That in fact, that confidence, the Pali word is shada. And if we feel that confidence, along with safety, security, comfortable, and satisfied, we wind up with the feeling of success. We wind up with the feeling, I've got this. Wow, what a nice thing this is. Okay, and this is the state that we're beginning to look for in let us say, in the intermediate. That intermediate is, I've got this. And then the end of it is that there's nothing to it. We're all in this together.
I see.
So does that answer your question, Joshua?
That does, and it opens up another one if that's okay. Just something that I've been wondering about, like just if there is if everything is changing and everything can be changed, then like what is there really to take refuge in? Like, is there something permanent that we can take refuge in, or is that wrong view in itself to
All
look
right.
after?
We can look at it in the sense of the triple gem or the three refuges.
Mm.
Okay, the first one would take refuge into, I've got this, or into the refuge of awakening. I can see this. Now, I'm using the word I can see this because that's built into the language. The language, the English language, actually uses those pronouns, but Thai generally doesn't use pronouns. So we can use language something like "see" or even "wow." That would take the self out of it, or the I, me's, and mine pronouns out of it, as well as taking them out. So we can also take refuge in the Dhamma, the teaching of the Buddha. We can take refuge, in fact, into the Four Noble Truths. Wow, I can see. Wow, I can change. And then the last refuge would be the refuge into the Sangha, your noble friends. In the Wat, it would be all the other monks that are in the Wat as opposed to what's going on outside the Wat. We can also, in fact, see and encourage the experience of this Discord server is actually a refuge. It's a refuge because the people who are going there are going to give you noble responses. And so we can actually take refuge in our friends. We can take refuge in noble friendship. This is the Sangha. So the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, those are the three things, the triple gem, that we would take refuge in. And we can use the word refuge in the sense of a ship that's out at sea. That means that the mind and the person is out in the world, and that we can come into port. We could come in and anchor ourselves, or better still, tie ourselves to the port, which is stable and foundational. And so we can take refuge, or we can get out of the stormy weather and get into a beautiful mental state that's not all topsy-turvy.
Hmm. Thank
So,
you. Yes.
Go ahead, Joshie. I'm listening.
Yes, that answers it very, very beautifully. Thank you.
Okay. So, Mr. Green Sage, do you have anything to say?
No, sir. I'm just listening tonight.
All right. How about you, Mr. Deja Vu? I've seen you before.
Yes, I'm just here. There were a couple like times I wanted to add a bit of like conversation within sort of the topic, but I think like the way you're flowing is still great enough. I didn't. I would imagine that there would be a time for a better opportunity from a discussion point that would probably make the conversation interesting to flow out of. But as it stands, I pretty much like follow with everything that's being talked about here. The only thing I only add or think about is stuff with like what Ram Dass talks about with being here and now.
Well, we've actually been talking about that a lot. That in fact, Ram Dass got that to his teacher, but it goes all the way back to the Buddha. There's in fact suttas. Number 131 is probably the best example about be here now. But in fact, in the very early part of the conversation here, we were talking about becoming in a state of dispassion. That's exactly the same thing as being here now, because always our passions are based upon the future and the past. Also, we talked about parent, adult, and child, or our feelings, our supposed to be's, and the reality. The reality is always experienced right here, right now. So I don't see any disagreement other than.
I think there was one time Ram Dass said that the ego is constrained by time as well, and that
Yeah.
like when you're because that's also really like what because I always refer to sort of the teachings or stories Maharaji had, where there were such profound moments of beyondness within his teaching, where he would have lessons or experiences for others that were unexplainable, sort of because there's sort of a connectedness within the universe's uh, energy flow that allows many things to extend itself over to achieve the impossible. But only it's very interesting when you reference like people's perception of infinite, that it's only a perception, because that's the same thing with impossible. Impossible is only just a perspective.
Mm-hmm. Or it's the result of perception. It's the result of it's not the story, it's the making up of the story. But anyway, I understand what you're saying. So thank you for that. The one last thing that I'll say is that the Brahman that the Buddha dealt with is not Hinduism of today. The Brahmanism that we have from the time of the Buddha was actually the worst part and the bulk of Hinduism. But Hinduism has had many, many influences over the centuries, and that Buddhism, in fact, has had a major impact upon Hinduism, especially in the sense of the way of practice. Being here now and coming out of our perceptions and all of that kind of stuff was actually introduced to Hinduism through the Buddha's teachings, as opposed to the old Brahmanism was about the past and the future. So let's see if anybody else. Hamza Simon, do you have anything to say? So how about you, Eddie?
Yeah. So I like how you mentioned we could take refuge in the triple gem. And I was also thinking about his question about change. And I was thinking we can also take refuge in change, in impermanence. If I don't know, there's a way of looking at it, I feel, that you can take refuge in, and another way of looking at it where it's scary or causing an unwholesome state to arise. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that when you're taking refuge in impermanence, that's just taking refuge in the Dhamma. Would be the same thing.
Yep.
Taking refuge in the Dhamma. That in fact the taking refuge in change, or the word is anicca, sabe anicca sankara, sabe dukkha sankara, and sabe anatta Dhamma, which means then that anything that can be stuck together will change. Anything that is stuck together is subject then to dukkha because it's changing. But that there is no self, there is no inherent core anywhere. And so, if you don't mind, I'll expand upon that just a little bit. You would think that water is always water. Oh, no. That in fact, on the surface of the ocean, there is enough energy coming from the sun that it can actually split that molecule and release oxygen and hydrogen. They used to not think that there was enough energy, but we're talking about enough energy at a small enough point that there is enough energy to break that atom apart. But we also now understand the Greek word for atom means not splittable. And yet we now know that things are splittable, even not only a water molecule, but the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms can be split. And not only that, but the electron can be forced into the nucleus of the hydrogen atom, causing a neutron. Also, the neutrons and the protons can be split apart. All we've been able to do is to go down to quarks, gluons, and things like that, but we don't know the end of it. So in this regard, what I'm saying is that everything is compounded. All the atoms of the world, all the universe, your entire human body, in fact, is just made up of bazillions of cells, and those cells, each one of them are made up of bazillions of atoms, and we don't know the end of it. Everything is temporary like that. Anything that's stuck together as a compound can be broken apart. That means that there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of anicca happening, but in no place in any of that will you find something inherently a self. Now, Nagarjuna had the session with Melinda where he used the example of a chariot. He says, I'll explain it to you this way if you will allow me and your men. And they took the chariot apart. Put the wheels over there, the tongue over there, the basket over here, the harnesses over there. And then he asked Melinda, where is the chariot? Guess what? The chariot is in the mind. But the component parts are just component parts. There's no self. There's no chariotness there anywhere. There's no such thing as a chariot. We can use the same thing nowadays as a bicycle or a car. There's no car there. It's just a collection of parts. There's batteries and there's chargers and there's copper wires in the motor and there's magnets and stuff like that, but there is no Tesla there. So this is the way that we begin to think of things, is that in fact there is no self anywhere, because everything is subject to transition. Everything is put together, stuck together, comes back apart. Anicca vata sankhara. Everything is changing. Any questions about that from anybody?
I
Yeah, I
guess
have another question.
Oh,
Okay,
you
Eddie, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, if there is no self, how would you define the self?
All right. I didn't actually ever say there was no self. I was saying there's no inherent body or uniqueness there. There's no atta. There's no soulness there. And you change that to self. So now let's talk about it in the sense of what is a self is that which defines itself as a self. So you could say that self then is ignorance, but a better way of looking at it and more useful in practice is to recognize that there is no Eddie, there's just something as a moving target. Now, let's use the example of a high-speed film or photographs that you're taking a photo of a high-speed train or maybe even a Maserati or a car, and it's just racing by. As it's racing by, the photos are actually showing there's blurs there, that it's not really a good defined image. So it is also true with your personality. It's got blurs in it. It's not well defined, that you're a moving target. And that's really useful when along comes a high speed insult. And here it comes flying directly at you. But if you can step out of the way, it doesn't hit you. You, in fact, don't have to make yourself a fixed target so that insult gets me. Oh, he insulted me. Oh, he hurt me. No, you can say, miss me. I got out of the way. Okay, so begin to think of the self as a moving target. Can you move fast enough to get out of the way? To get out of the way of your own dukkha? In other words, it's not fixed, it's movable. Sometimes it's just not even there. It arises and passes away, and it moves at high speed at the speed of thought. Does that answer your question, Eddie?
Yeah.
All right. So we're coming along to about the end of the hour. Does anybody have any last comments?
Well, my question was because I think it's interesting how self is defined the way you talked about it, because self is always ever changing, as every single aspect of being or energy always has and always will expand and change, and it has impermanence to it. But I was just sort of interested because I think in the conversation within what you had talked about before, something had brought attention to a thought I had about sort of things holding consciousness, and how I kind of maybe associated that self may not have a association to consciousness, and I'd like to explore that idea of like what is consciousness then.
All right. We can talk about that as an entirely new topic next week.
Okay.
But we'll start with it with this much. Consciousness is dependently arising. There is no such thing as a consciousness that is whole. You're actually talking about it as if it were a soul or a self. But consciousness just arises and passes away. You hear something, then you see something, then you touch something, and then you bite something, and then you think something, and all of those are different consciousness. Not only that, but when you're in deep sleep, there's no consciousness there, and there's certainly no consciousness when you're dead. So think of consciousness as something that is dependent, and when the aggregates of that dependency come together, then consciousness arises. This is possibly the biggest difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, is the Hinduism, especially in the time of the Buddha, had the idea that consciousness was permanent, and therefore consciousness was that which migrated from here to yonder. And the Buddha was very specific in Sutta number 38 to say, no, consciousness is dependent. You're not the same person. If you move out of New York and you move to Chicago, you're not the same person in Chicago as you were in New York. How could that possibly be that you're the same person from lifetime to lifetime? Not possible.
Right.
And that consciousness is dependently arising. It's always new, something new.
Right. I think from what you said is interesting to make the understanding that consciousness is more of frames of a being, or frames of experience or situations, rather than a framework of consciously, or having consciousness be affiliated to a sense of active awareness within oneself.
Mm-hmm. So consciousness then is here now. This
Mhm.
consciousness right now, as
Right.
opposed to consciousness from last week.
Right, and it's always changing and being affected by its own experience of the here and now, because it's always changing and it isn't impermanent. But I think it's kind of interesting. Something I wanted to ask another question, because you talked about death, and I was just curious because of the ideas within dreams. That dreams, Alan Watts once talked about that we've experienced death before, and it comes to us from our birth and when we dream. I wonder what your perspective on that is.
Well, I don't have a personal perspective. I don't give a flying rip. However, the Buddha was also in that same realm, in the sense of dreams. I mean, you can't even pay close attention to your own thoughts when you're awake. So let's not pay much attention to dreams. They don't have much value, especially in the sense of dream interpretation or fortune telling or any of that kind of stuff. They're quite useless. So let's not pay any attention to dreams. Let's not give them any weight. It's basically why I would say there's nothing to it. And yet look how many people, New Agers and Hindus and all kinds of Christians, will think that dreams have something prophetic. I mean, Joseph in the Bible, he had dreams, and all of a sudden the entire civilization has got to change because of his stupid dreams.
So So then what sorry to keep asking, but what would be the unconscious?
It's not paying attention. That's what it is. It's under our radar. It's under our awareness. We're not paying attention. That's what the subconscious and the unconscious is. Then, in fact, you could say unconscious is, in fact, because some of the dependencies are missing. So it's unconscious. It doesn't exist. But you could say that subconscious is that it does exist. We're just not paying any attention to it.
Right. It's a framework of the brain that that it doesn't have any awareness to it because we resort or attach to our own consciousness awareness of ourselves and stuff like that. So there's layers into that. But it's very interesting that so you would say that the subconscious is sort of a delusion then?
Yes, absolute. Well, unconscious is even more delusional. Well,
Right.
let us say it's
But
actually
but
pure ignorance, but subconscious would then be delusional. We think we know when we don't.
so the subconscious, the way I've maybe heard it framed is that it's are some parts of the brain that are taking note of things that are out of our conscious awareness. So there is an awareness in subconscious or
But we're not paying
unconscious,
attention. Exactly.
but we're not but it brings itself out of awareness by bringing itself into consciousness.
Yeah, that would be a way of not paying attention. Let us say that in the night that you've gone to the bathroom, you don't turn the lights on because you know the way there and you stump your toe
Right.
because you didn't know where everything was.
It's only a
So
frame
pure
of
ignorance.
perception. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
well,
that's interesting.
all right. So wise ignorance would be, oh, I don't know the way to the bathroom. Let me turn the lights on. And delusion would be, oh, I know my way to the bathroom safely. And then we stub our toe. We didn't realize that the kid left a truck in the middle of the floor. Our mom moved the furniture.
Thank you for that answer.
Mm-hmm. All right. So does anybody else have any final things to say? All right. So Ivan, you're very clear about that. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, Mikey, why don't you take this thing home?
Yeah, thank you, friends, for being here today. This was a very enjoyable Dhamma discussion and talk. One thing I like to point out when people bring up there is no self, an easier way to say it that makes it more clear for many people is it's not yourself. Um, So it doesn't really matter, oh, is there a self? Is there not a self? It's just, it's not your self. It doesn't belong to you. That's the thing to look at. But yeah, if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the Dhammarato Dhamma YouTube channel. And in the video description, you can find a link to join us here on Discord in the Dhamma Friends Discord. We have calls hosted by Dhammarato, and we also have some other friends hosting calls now too, such as Ben and Marcus, and I think DJ might be hosting a call. I'm not sure. We'll have to check.
Dhammadas also.
Yeah, Dhammadasa is hosting a call too. So
And
yeah,
if you want, go to the one-on-one and request a call, and some of the senior students will be there to answer.
yeah, be
I
sure to put down a day and time when you're available, and we'll connect you with one of our seasoned practitioners.
Yes. When you say seasoned, I'll claim salt. I'm salty. That's my seasoning. As opposed to sweet. I'm not sweet. I'm just happily salty. So, thank you, Mikey. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.